independent strata consultancy firm StrataSolve, www.stratasolve.com.au. Alongside me virtually, Frank Higginson, partner, Hines Legal, industry expert of some renown. Frank, welcome.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone. Yet again.
For anybody who's a bit new to the show, we live stream to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 p.m. Brisbane time. So to follow us, go to Facebook, the Hines Legal page, and hit the like button and icon. And for YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Welcome your comments, queries, as many as you want to chuck through, and we'll try to get to those. Queries a bit more involved though. We'll put a link up in the comments that would be better for you to fill in, and we'll get back to you on that one. Today though, Frank, less about strata legislation, strata specifics, and more about interpersonal communication skills, isn't it? Today we're going to look at how committees can get a breakthrough with communicating with owners.
Yeah, and I mean, it's if you talk it in political terms, it's sort of controlling the narrative to a degree, isn't it?
Mm.
You know, and I think, like for me, we spend a lot of our lives arguing about what legislation says and whether people's behaviour is in accordance with that legislation, and all the rest of it. So when we're talking about committees' statutory obligations, we always start with that one to act reasonably, which is fine, and that means a whole bunch of different things to a whole bunch of different people, subject to which side of the fence you're on. And I think today, more than anything else, with both you and I, the genesis of a lot of the disputes that we see is poor communication, or misguided communication, or incorrect communication or otherwise. So we both think that there's a way, and there's a bunch of different ways that committees can sort of get ahead of those things that cause disputes. Because if you're going to have an argument about what's acting reasonably, in a sense, you've already lost the battle, because the fact you're having to defend your position means that there's an argument that you haven't done the right thing. Now, that might be misguided or might not, but today I think is more about, from a committee perspective, how do you start to communicate with everyone? And I think that's a really important thing we'll talk about as well, to let everyone know what's going on, to cut a lot of these issues off at the pass that keep us both busy.
Well, yeah, that's it. And speaking of which, I'll share a short anecdote from relatively recently. So I was engaged by a committee to go to a meeting and sort of talk with owners, and there were quite a few owners at this one, actually, surprisingly so. Anyway, I was blabbing on about common property and responsibility to maintain common property, as you do, and I referred to, I think at one point, poor maintenance. And in hindsight, Frank, I would have taken that back.
That was a judgy word.
Yeah, and it was picked up. It was picked up immediately by one party in the room, and you could tell that they took that as a personal insult because they just happened to be chairperson at the time. So it's a lesson there is that even the smallest. I like your use there, Frank, of, what did you call it? It was inappropriate communications or misguided communications. That was it. Great term. That was a misguided communication in a strata context because it kind of derailed things for a few minutes afterwards. And clearly that particular person remains offside, which is not great. But good learning experience, you do need to choose your words carefully, which goes to your point that if the communications haven't been great in the past, that then of itself leads to all of these other issues. So today it's about, well, getting that breakthrough, trying to claw back. No, not claw back, but get things better. And again, our mantra here, Frank, has always been, you don't have to be friends in a body corporate. In fact, you shouldn't be friends. It's a business transaction, effectively, isn't it?
It is. And corporate governance as a committee is absolutely that. You're running a business, the business of the body corporate. It has statutory responsibilities. It's got revenue obligations. It's got spending commitments. And it's really got stakeholder engagement, which is the owners and occupiers. So the best analogy still remains the listed company. You know, you've got BH, and obviously BHP is much bigger than most bodies corporates lurking around, but you have a board of directors who are there to look after the interests of the shareholders and make decisions in their best interests. And by the same token, BHP's job in terms of, or the board's job in terms of market announcements and all that sort of stuff. Now, those are required by statute, but they're communicating with everyone about what's going on with that company very, very regularly. And in a body corporate sense, and I get it, we both get it, it's the land of the volunteer. People are doing things out of the goodness of their heart usually, and don't necessarily have the time to commit to the communication stuff we're going to be talking about today. But if they did, there's probably a whole bunch of different outcomes that would be happening in relation to the day-to-day affairs of each body corporate.
And yeah, so when we talk about this particular broadcast being about how committees can better manage owner interactions, I'm sure there are plenty of individuals who don't like the idea of being managed. But if we use our business analogy, Frank, I think absolutely it is about managing the interactions and the communications. Yep. So we'll go over a few points, and these are based, I think it's fair to say, Frank, on our experiences of these things having gone wrong in the past.
There is no textbook for this.
Maybe this.
Oh, there you go. There's an idea.
There's a revenue stream.
Chris.
Yeah. Possible revenue stream. It's easy to write textbooks, isn't it? You just do that in a minute or two. All right. Our first one. Communicate as one voice. What do we mean by that, Frank?
Well, it's almost, it's not quite collective decision making, and this is a really difficult thing. And I suppose here's a little sidebar. I really enjoy political autobiographies of both sides of the fence. I'm in the middle of reading the Bob Hawke one by Troy Barrington at the moment. I read the Turnbull one not that long ago, and Turnbull made a really interesting observation in terms of cabinet and politics and all that sort of stuff. He said in business you can pick who you want to be in business with. In politics you can't. They're thrust upon you by the electorate. And that's the same thing that happens here in Strata. But, and again, obviously at a lower commitment level potentially, and certainly at a less remunerated level. But what we're talking about here is trying not to have the leaks from cabinet and trying to have people running different agendas. Because if there's difficulty that comes from these things, it's when there's a little faction, because factions happen in body corporates as much as they do in politics, where Chris's faction is the group of 3, my faction is the group of 4, which means that my faction has voting control, and suddenly Chris's faction is white-handing things behind the scenes and needling away and all that sort of stuff. It is much, much better for every building for the committee to speak as a whole in terms of this is the committee's position. And that's really that cabinet solidarity element, isn't it? Even you go into cabinet, you have arguments about things and you have disagreements, but then once you come out, that's the position.
And so, part of the work of that cabinet and therefore the committee is agreeing on the position that will be communicated. So as you say, Frank, you don't have to necessarily get consensus. And in fact, in a committee, you don't get consensus. It's a majority decision. So fine, win, lose, whatever, the committee still needs to communicate as a single voice. So what does that mean in practical terms? It means that when you're emailing, you sign off as the committee or on behalf of the committee. That depersonalizes things as a start.
And you send that via the body corporate manager, who everyone knows is well, not everyone knows, but most people should understand is a contracted party providing services to the body corporate. They're not the decision maker. So suddenly it's not Chris Irons, chairperson, whose people are going to target. It's the committee, which is this nebulous thing that hides behind the scenes. So 100% that depersonalization and that collective voice is a much, much better way to communicate, particularly always, mate, as we say, you want the temperature in the room. If it's a difficult issue and a contested issue in the body corporate, that single point of communication is much, much better way to go.
I'm sure there's some people listening to this who'll go, well, that's, big deal. That won't make any difference. You've got to start somewhere, and it's about repetition. Reinforcing it. I can almost guarantee you if you continue to do that consistently, you will start to see results. That's how these things work. What about subcommittees and working groups, Frank?
Well, and I suppose this is the thing, like there's nothing in the legislation about subcommittees or working groups, but lots of bodies corporates operate that way where, again, our committee of 7, we've got 3 people, we're going to do a pool refurbishment. So those 3 people go away, they run around, look at the styles, the pebblecreting versus concreting, et cetera, and then come back to the committee and say, okay, here's what we think. Now that's not that subcommittee making a decision in their own right. That's them doing the investigative work, putting up to the committee as a whole and saying, okay, here we go. These are the choices. This is what we think is the best way to go. And then the committee as a whole would say, cool, that's it. Up we go to general meeting for our approvals and all that sort of thing. So I think, though, and when we're talking about acting as a collective voice, it's really important to make it clear, particularly again on these contested issues in buildings, that you don't present yourself, if you're on one of those subcommittees, as speaking for the committee. I'm here. We're trying to put this together so the whole of the committee can understand it, and then the body corporate can approve it. So, can you help with this? Yep. Whatever it might be. And again, that's part of that depersonalization. And it's really not about deflecting responsibility. It's about recognizing the role that you've actually got, and that is as a subcommittee to recommend.
Related to that, Frank, and this happens fairly often, that on committees, particularly committees of 7 and in larger buildings, each member of the committee has a distinct responsibility usually to do certain things. And if that's what you've agreed, then that's fine. In fact, it's a really good idea. But just be sure to communicate appropriately in that case. And the best way you can do that, again, if it's an email or in an open forum, I am the committee member responsible for liaising with our on-site manager, and I'm writing to you in that capacity and on behalf of the committee. So again, you're reinforcing this idea that you're not operating as an individual. You have a role as an individual, but that remains very much part of the committee.
And you see that from a lot of body corporate managers too, don't you? That's how they start their correspondence.
Yep.
That's how they make it clear.
Too, don't they?
Yeah, we act for. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a newsletter.
Consultants do that too. Yeah.
There's a newsletter we wrote a while back about individual committee roles. So, inside the legislation, there is some statutory framework for chairperson, secretary, treasurer, not necessarily ordinary. So we'll put up a link to that. But that's not really what we're talking about here today. But if you want to see what's actually in there about roles, that's what it is.
Good point, Frank. Our next sort of headline issue for breaking through and getting those committee communications better, less is more. War and Peace emails turn people off or inflame the situation, or both. Can you be turned off and inflamed at this? Yeah, I suppose you could.
Yeah, if you put something inflammatory early in a War and Peace email, absolutely.
I've got a client at the moment, Frank, and sort of sent a few materials in recently, and I was taking a look at one communication amongst some committee members, and it just went forever. If you sort of wrote it down on like your A4, it would have been probably 3 or 4 pages, this email. And it wasn't about anything especially dramatic either. It was just long. And what had happened, you could see that was then permeating to other people. So somebody has started that way, and now most people are doing that. And that makes sense, doesn't it, Frank? If, say, for example, you and I are communicating and I start out with a 10-page rant or thesis, over time, you might actually start to respond that way. It's human nature. Yep.
And it's an interesting strategic thing in those elements of do I play in your ball court or do I set my own? So if I suddenly accept, again, a little sidebar, the way you're deciding to put the issues forward and I play that way, then absolutely I'm going to get dragged into your reality, which might not be where we should be, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, it's, and I think for me, where I get to with long pieces of correspondence is certainly my attention span. I've got the attention span of a goldfish at times. I'm short, sharp, in, out. If I want to sit down and read something, usually for me on a day-to-day basis, that's going to be a client-related issue. So I'll spend the time to do that. I don't really want to throw myself into personal issues and read pages and pages of diatribe of something. And I think if you, in a body corporate context, the person writing the epistle clearly feels strongly about it. The people that are potentially on the other side of it, or the recipients or the people affected by what's going on in there, might want to get into it. But I'd say the other 95% of people in the body corporate, if you get a 5 or 6 page piece of correspondence, screw it up and put it in the bin, because they've got other things going on in their lives. So you don't actually even get the outcome you're looking for, which is for people to understand the issue.
That's right. So from the committee's point of view, short, sharp paragraphs, always the way to go. Use an exec summary. There's a lot to be said for executive summaries in this context, I reckon. The actual emails should be short, and if need be, provide the much longer attachment. So rather than give every piece of information in your email should be that much, and then you've got the attachment with everything that you need in
So
it.
people that want to dig into it, go your hardest.
They can use the search function in the attachment if they really want. Say only as much as necessary. And this is one that I'm a firm believer in. The more that you say in an email, the more opportunity you give somebody to rebut, reply, and respond. And you actually don't want that as a committee. You don't want to invite further responses in most cases. You actually just want to communicate. So avoid giving too much information. Just say what's necessary. Yep. Big one, avoid speculation and hyperbole or hyperbole, to quote a former Prime Minister. And yeah, avoid emotional pejorative phrases and words. My example before of poor maintenance.
Judgy words.
Judgy, it's a good one, Frank. Avoid
and that's probably maybe back to grade 2 level. But yeah, it's yeah, and mate, this is back to challenging people versus nuisance owners. You're way back when, so it's labels. And if you're going to label something that can be interpreted in a negative way, then inevitably that will apply to someone looking at them saying, well, blah. And I think probably the other thing is, if there's expert advice lurking around, just be real careful about including and referencing that, you know. And how many times have we both seen, I've got legal advice and it says,
yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, one of the things that we're really big on in contested issues for bodies corporate is you've got to be really careful with how you reference what advice you may have received, because you can waive privilege potentially in relation to that. So privilege is a completely separate issue. And certainly simple rule of Fight Club is, if something's been given to the committee and it's privileged in terms of legal advice and sometimes other expert reports under the cover of privilege, it's not available for all owners, even though they've paid for it. So there's that. Something that might knock some people off their chairs, but you'll be real careful about telling people what's going on in a sense with legal advice. So just balance that one.
Keep it high level, Frank. So our advice, would it be okay, Frank, to say our advice strongly recommends, and then the short summary of it?
Yeah, or even absolutely, subject to the context of what it is that you're talking about. We've received advice that we're following appropriate processes in relation to this particular issue.
I think, that one.
Full stop. Yep.
And leave it, as you say, leave it at that. I too have seen a couple of examples with clients where they've said too much and it's caused some problems. So avoid. Let's move on to our next tip. This is about, might sound a bit strange to say this, but don't over rely on formal processes and timing. Some informal ones work too. I guess what we mean by that is you don't have to wait for the AGM or a committee meeting for the issue of minutes. Communication can and probably should happen outside of that, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. Like, you know, if you go to an AGM, particularly if something's on a secret ballot, you don't know what the outcome is until the night of the meeting. So, and that information process and that engagement process doesn't need to be just from when the agenda is sent to when the vote is actually held. It can go on for months before that. And again, particularly with contentious issues, particularly with issues that might involve the spending of money, which obviously near and dear to everyone's heart all of the time, there's no reason not to get people engaged. So, we did a webinar a little while ago talking about a process at Admiralty Towers 2 where there was an attempt to engage owners in a way that really didn't work. So we'll put up a link to that so people can see what happened there. But even, I think, Chris, you've done some town hall type things, haven't you, where bodies corporates have got issues and it's like, well, let's wheel in this Strata consultant to answer all the questions now and deal with issues now before we get to the night of the AGM and have a big bun fight about it.
Yep, that's right. And indeed, so I've done a couple of those, and look, I won't lie, they're tough work, and can be pretty full on. They do absolutely have the desired effect, though. I can verify that from pretty recent experience, and one in particular. The other thing to note there, Frank, is that the use of those kinds of forums have been noted in adjudicators' orders in the past as being evidence that the committee can point to of reasonableness. So I think there's one in particular, Frank.
I think I know the one that you're talking about, where, yeah, someone was vehemently opposed to a particular solution and didn't show up to any of the 3 information nights that the committee had put on in relation to this is what we're doing and this is why, and that absolutely got mentioned in the decision.
Yeah, as well, how could that person possibly claim to not know what was going on when they were given multiple opportunities to find out? There's a lot to be said for that kind of process, but not just the forum, but there are different strokes for different folks. You're not going to do a town hall forum for a 6-pack, for example, but there are different options there. Give that some, as a committee, you should be giving those sorts of things some real thought. Next up, a bit old-fashioned, but newsletters and communiques. Absolutely. Don't dismiss the value of them. And this is, it's interesting, we're talking about something old-fashioned, but there's actually a social media, and we'll get to social media in a minute, but there's a social media element to this one. It is generally accepted that for social media, if you post the same time, in the same manner, on the same day, and keep doing it regularly, people will actually come to expect that and look forward to it in some cases. The same goes here with newsletters and communiques. If you're publishing them regularly, same day, same time, same format, people are eventually going to get used to it and come to expect it and anticipate it. I think there's a lot to be said. And again, for a particularly large scheme, I think that's absolutely the way to go. And this is an opportunity to get people involved as well. So if you've got people on the committee, or just generally people who are friendly to the committee and have got skills that you could use here, so like graphic design, computer skills, maybe
communications.
Maybe somebody at your
former
scheme,
journos,
PR gurus, maybe they're involved. Get them involved and get them to contribute to the content. Because Frank, give people the information.
I think so. Like, I think one of the reasons, and again, usually people don't ring Chris and I and say, I'm just letting you know everything's going great. They're ringing us with, I've got a problem. So, and that problem for me can have as its genesis lack of information, and even then distribution of partial information. So noting what I said about privilege just earlier, in relation to a whole bunch of other things that aren't privileged, like from my perspective, in a sense, why not give people all of the information that relates to the committee decision making, or make it available to them via some portal or otherwise? Because the amount of times that people have contacted us with concerns because they've only got part of the story. Because part of the story means, what are they hiding? Why haven't they done this? Why haven't they investigated this? Because if they don't know, and that's where the scary things are. It's in those shadows where people, have I got everything I need? So from my end, like transparency in the body corporate, adjudicators are huge on it, access to records is huge, and all that sort of stuff. Transparency is an enormous part of gaining trust. And I suppose if you get to the stage where you are engaging transparently with your community on almost everything, then there is a substantial element of trust that will come to that. There's also a substantial element of accountability, don't get me wrong, but ultimately that's what you're there for.
Absolutely.
So I think hiding things or not giving all the information, I think, is usually a red flag to people. And there's enough people out there believing in conspiracy theories that probably have no basis at all. There's no need to add another one to it.
Yeah, no, don't give fuel for that fire. We've got a few more things. This might even get us to a part 2, Frank, given the amount of content that we've got left. But just one or two more in the time we have left. A really sort of obvious one: committees. Work with your on-site manager. That's what they are there for, to work with you to achieve like-minded outcomes. So work with them, because they're the people who are going to know the nitty-gritty of what's going on. If you don't have a great relationship with your on-site manager, that's a whole separate issue that we're talking about here, and we've spoken about that one at length, Frank. But definitely
we're starting with, hopefully you've got a good relationship and you can make it work.
Business relationship again, business-like relationship. One that I know you and I, Frank, are really sort of keen on is the idea of social media in Strata. whether or not it might be the tool of Satan. I think it probably is, actually. I think social media generally is the tool of Satan, but in Strata, it's I think super challenging. It's pretty common, isn't it, Frank, for, again, larger buildings to maybe have a Facebook page or a Facebook group, or some other kind of social media belonging that, if you're an owner or an occupier, a committee, you'd be part of. That sounds great for communication purposes, but the big problem here with social media, it's largely unmoderated.
It is, and I think you've almost got to turn comments off. That's the brutal reality of it. You see defamation cases with the big media companies. We had our Google issues forever ago that drove us onto YouTube as opposed to a Facebook source. Left unchecked, it can be truly terrifying. So as a source of information and a communication tool, great. As a tool for ongoing discussion, terrifying, because who's actually in control of that? Who's moderating it? How is it going to be managed? What happens if someone does post something defamatory or something false? We're going to have these slanging matches. I'm with you. So I think it is a great means to get messages out. It's not necessarily a great means for further engagement beyond that, in my book, in Strata.
I agree, Frank. And the other thing to remember about that depending upon who is involved, that can easily go viral, and it can easily end up in the media. And I think we've seen plenty of instances where these sorts of things have ended up in media where they absolutely should not be. And they had their genesis way back in social media. Frank, we need to start wrapping things up, and we've got several more things that we actually wanted to get into. We might just quickly say all of this is about preventative measures and measures committee can take to repair and restore. But in the event where things have gone wrong, and you actually need some intervention, then there is no substitute for getting third-party help as required. That might be legal advice and options, Frank. It might be Strata consultancy services for alternative dispute resolution. It might be the Commissioner's office. Unfortunately, it might be the police in some cases. It might be dispute resolution centres. It might be agencies like the Public Guardian and the Public Trustee, depending upon who is involved and what is going on. There are many options, I suppose, Frank, that committees can follow up for that intervention. But hopefully you don't get there. Hopefully you take the time and the effort to not get to that point. Let's quick,
yeah. No, I was going to say, mate, at the start you said some people might say, but that particular issue won't work in my building. Well, you know what? If you combine a whole bunch of these things and do it repeatedly over time and effectively train people, because again, there's no Strata training to become an owner or an occupier, you'll eventually get there. But if you don't, if nothing changes, nothing changes.
You make a good point about training people, because that's essentially what this is. You're training people to interact differently with you. So a reminder to everybody again that if you are new to the show, we live stream to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 o'clock Brisbane time. So to follow us on Facebook, go to Heinz Legal page and hit the like button and icon. For YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you'll also get some follow-up material on the webinar, and there's some really useful information that comes out there, including some links as well. That's it though for this time, Frank. Thank you. It's been great.
Definitely a part 2 of this one. Likewise, mate. And this is solving problems rather than reacting to them, which is actually a very enjoyable thing.
That's right. Stay tuned for part 2, everyone. And again, thanks for taking the time to tune and listen in. It's always appreciated. Until next time.
Thanks, everyone.
See you. Bye-bye. Including some links as well. That's it though for this time, Frank. Thank you. It's been great.
Definitely a part 2 of this one. Likewise, mate.